Erev Tov, tonight we are going to be detectives. Coming up in just a few days, or even less than a few days, is a minor holiday known as Lag BaOmer. Now, literally, the first part, Lag, is the Hebrew letter Lamed and Gimel, and the Hebrew letters, Otiot, can stand for numbers, so it means the 33rd of the Omer. So one of the first things we'll do, as you can see in my section A, is just talk about what is the mitzvah of the Omer, but then the two mysteries that we're going to explore tonight. Many people are familiar that there are certain mourning practices, which we've talked about, but we'll review quickly, certain mourning practices during the period of the Omer. So we'll remind ourselves of that. However, on Lag BaOmer, those mourning practices disappear. So our first mystery is why? Why specifically on the 33rd of the Omer do those go away? And then the other thing is, in many places, Lag BaOmer is not just a removal, either temporarily or for the rest of the Omer of those mourning practices. It becomes a massive day of celebration with bonfires, bows and arrows, and just a huge party day, people getting married all over the place. So how did it go from just a minor removing the mourning practices to this huge celebration? And Bekitzor, in short, the answer to both of those questions is nobody really knows. And what we're going to see is we don't need to go to complex scholarly we will look at some academic sources, at least one hypothesis, but even within traditional sources, some I brought in, some I'll just mention, the rabbis recognize that there's a lot unknown here. And it's almost, I don't know if this is the right analogy, but it's almost like a house of cards. The practices that we have today are built on some very rickety, more like Jenga, some very rickety pieces. And if you actually start to pull at the threads, things start to unravel. And a lot of rabbis, again, including traditional ones for decades, if not at least a century or two, have been saying something's not right here. Something is not lining up. And what's interesting is if you go to certain websites, more outreach traditional ones, they'll say with certain confidence that this is absolutely what Lag BaOmer is about. But if you push them and say, well, what's your source for that? They might point to one, and then you look at that and you go back 2 or 3 steps and you find that maybe you have a source from 10 years ago that says, this is what Lag BaOmer is. What did you base it on? And they're like, well, I think I heard it from my, there's just a lot of mystery and unknown there. And we're going to try and pick at those pieces and not perhaps come up with some ideas about what's going on. But again, at the end of the day, the short answer is we don't know. So with that in mind, Tamar, I will go ahead and unmute you first. And the first place is very simple, is just to establish what is the Omer in general? What is the significance of this period in which we're in right now, in which we're building up to the 33rd day? So go ahead, Tamar, the first source from Vayikra, which was just a week or 2 ago, I think, please.
And from the day on which you bring the sheaf of the elevation offering, the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. You must count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord.
Excellent. So when it says that sheaf, a kind of plant of elevation, that's the Omer of Tnufa, of waving, but essentially this is an agricultural / spiritual holiday. It has both significance of it, and it connects Pesach to Shavuot. Basically, after Pesach, they would go into harvest season, and they would harvest for 49 days, and on the 50th day, as a way of, essentially, I'm simplifying, but from context, to show gratitude towards God, they would bring an offering from the crops that they had just harvested, bring it to the temple, make it as an offering, and by doing that, by offering... What's that?
From the first crops.
Exactly, from the best of the best. The first ones that they would do, they would give a small portion to God. And then by doing that, it's essentially saying to God, not only are we grateful, but we're kind of asking permission. We wouldn't have these crops at all if not for your blessings, God. So we are giving some of it up to you for recognition. We would have 0 without you. So giving up a little bit is nothing. So that's the beauty and the message of the Omer. And we'll talk more about that on Shavuot. But there's a specific mitzvah, which the Torah doesn't explain, about counting the days, both the days and the weeks, which is why when it was, 28 days, you say that's 28 days, which is 4 weeks of the Omer, 7 times 4. That's the Omer. That's as simple as it. It doesn't say anything about Lag BaOmer. It does not mention anywhere in the entirety of the Tanakh. Now we get to the Talmud. And the Talmud is going to add a new layer to the significance of this period, because up until now, historically, for thousands of years, the Omer was just a counting period. with all those spiritual things I mentioned, but it was a farming time with a mitzvah of counting. So Jane, go ahead and unmute you. And again, we've seen this source before, but it's good to have it in mind because it is the basis of much of what will happen. So it brings a story, and this story is repeated in multiple rabbinic sources in basically the exact same version. So go ahead, please, Jane.
They said that Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students in an area of land that stretched from Gavat to Antipatris in Judea. And they all died in one period of time because they did not treat each other with respect. And the world was desolate of Torah until Rabbi Akiva came to our rabbis in the south and taught us his Torah to them. This second group of disciples consisted of Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua. And these are the very ones who upheld the study of Torah at that time. Although Rabbi Akiva's earlier students did not survive, his later disciples were able to transmit the Torah to future generations. With regard to the 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva's students, the Gemara adds, it is taught that all of them died in the period from Passover until Shavuot. Rav Chama bar Abba said, and some say it was Rabbi Chia bar Avin, they all died a bad death. The Gemara inquires, what is it that is called a bad death? Rav Nachman said, diphtheria.
Excellent, thank you. So Rabbi Akiva who's considered one of the greatest rabbis in our history, and he actually came to his Judaism later, was living in the Roman times. So this is between the year 0 and the year 100. And unfortunately, he himself was killed by the Romans for teaching Torah. And in this particular teaching, it says that he had thousands of students. It gives a very specific round number, which the Gemara often does. In fact, there was a midrash I was reading the other day talking about the greatness of Yerushalayim. And it said in Yerushalayim, there were 48 districts, and in each district, there were this many neighborhoods, this many houses, etc. But if you were to calculate based on that midrash, it would have meant that 9.5 trillion people were living in Yerushalayim 5,000 years ago or something like that. The point is, don't take numbers quite literally, but clearly many, many followers of Rabbi Akiva died. Now, the explanation here is because they didn't show each other proper respect. Maybe. The other possibility is that Rabbi Akiva was involved in a number of rebellions and backing a man known as Bar Kokhba, who he thought was the Messiah, the Mashiach, in a rebellion against the Romans, which failed and thousands died. Is this the rabbi's way of putting this in code so they don't anger the Romans? More likely, but regardless, many thousands of students who were bringing Torah to the world died. Rabbi Akiva did survive for some time, but he didn't have any students to pass on his tradition. So these 4 students, he passed his Torah on to. We're going to come back to one of them later, called here Rabbi Shimon, short for Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, or Rashbi. But the point is, Rabbi Akiva, basically his entire school was wiped out, and he wanted to pass it on before he died or ultimately was killed. Now, the second, so that's the first part of tradition. During the Roman times, thousands of these people died. When did they die? And in the Torah, the Talmud is quite explicit, and it says in the Hebrew that it was mi Pesach, from Pesach ad Atzeret. Atzeret is from the Hebrew word atzor, meaning stop, but it very much means Shavuot, because Shavuot is the end of the period from Pesach to Shavuot. It ends that period of the counting of the Omer. So the death of these students from Pesach to Shavuot. Now, we're not going to read all the other sources, but the later tradition became that is why we have mourning practices. Specifically, the main one is not getting married. It also mentions not getting haircuts and not shaving, and a few additional ones, but the main one is to not get married. But again, the pieces we have now, Rabbi Akiva students, thousands died, not sure why, but they did die. He had to find some new students to pass on Torah, which thank God he did. And these students, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua, Rabbi Meir, 5, not 4, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi are some of the greatest teachers of our tradition. Is whether or not this is simplifying the actual story, we would not have as rich a Judaism today if not for these 5 specific men who continued the tradition of Torah. And that period, again, from Pesach to Shavuot, was one of the saddest, most devastating times in Jewish history. Hence, it is a time of mourning. That's all we have here. What's not mentioned at all? The thing that's not mentioned, Lag BaOmer, not mentioned at all. It is not mentioned at all in the Torah, neither is this, and it is not mentioned anywhere in the Talmud. So when did Lag BaOmer get any significance? So now we're going to go to section, I guess I said section C, the significance of the 33rd day of Lag BaOmer. And Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, but I'll have you take more than one source because they're so short in this first one. We're not even going to translate. In fact, I'll just explain this. The Lag BaOmer is mentioned a number of times in somewhat early sources. This is actually, I believe, one of the earliest ones. One of the earlier ones, all it mentions about Lag BaOmer is that it often falls out on the same day, I think, of the week as Purim, but it doesn't say anything about Lag BaOmer at all. It might just be a clever little play on, the calendar or something like that. One of the earliest sources, and we have others around this time that mention this too, that gives any significance to the 33rd day of the Omer, which will always be the 18th of the month of Iyar, because the Jewish calendar, it will always be the same day, is there's this poem by Elazar HaKalir, who lived in the Byzantine Empire, somewhere in the Middle East, 7th century. And in a poem found in the Cairo Geniza, and I didn't translate it because it's poetry and I couldn't even figure out some of the words, but in the middle of it, in bold, he has this phrase, Tzom Yehoshua bishmona asar bo Iyar. There's a fast for Yehoshua from the Torah. There was a tradition that Joshua from the Torah, the disciple of Moses, died on the 18th of Iyar, which is always going to be the 33rd day of the Omer, Lag BaOmer. So actually, for quite some time in our early rabbinic history, Lag BaOmer was not a joyous day. It was actually a fast day. It was a Yahrzeit. And there is a tradition, which not everyone follows, but some follow, that on the memorial of the passing of someone who passed away, which we call, based on the Yiddish, we call it Yahrzeit, there's a custom to fast on that day. And that is a very, very ancient custom to do so. And this is mentioning that that was a fast day to remember Yehoshua. So there is some significance to Lag BaOmer as the Yahrzeit of Yehoshua. So forget about making it a day of removing mourning things. We're actually adding on practices that are more in coinciding with remembering those who have been lost. So at what point did it start shifting to be not about the fast of the Yahrzeit of Joshua or about the death of his students? And that starts to really happen in the 13th century, actually quoting a work from the 12th century. And this is the main source. It is the earliest written source. And with all written sources, it's very important to remember that whatever the custom they're mentioning is, it probably started before that. It always started, it could have been around for 50 years, 100 years, but this is the earliest recorded source for Lag BaOmer having some of the significance we give today. So this is a Spanish work from Toledo, 13th century. And again, he's quoting a 12th century rabbi. So Lynn, go ahead, this book of custom, Sefer HaManhig. Go ahead, the custom should be in France and Provence.
The custom in France and Provence is to get married from the 33rd day of the Omer onwards. And I heard in the name of Rabbi Zerachia Halevi from Girona that he found written in an ancient book, which came from Spain, that they only died from Pesach until Pros Atzeret, 15 days before Atzeret, which is Lag BaOmer.
Now, there's something I didn't include in here because it just makes my head spin. But basically, the simple thing of this earlier Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, our text in the Talmud said that the students died from Pesach until Atzeret, which is 100. No one disagrees that it doesn't mean Shavuot. Everyone agrees it's Shavuot. His version had one extra word, totally legit. There are multiple manuscripts. That word is pros. Now the word pros, in fact, Tamar, I'm going to unmute you. I'm curious, Tamar, do you have in modern Hebrew the word pros at all?
I'm no expert, but I am not familiar with it.
And it's probably not from Hebrew. There is a version of it somewhere that might be connected to Hebrew. We're going to come back to that. I was just curious if it's at all, existed in modern Hebrew, but the simple meaning of it in Hebrew is something like half. Now, half of 50 is not 15, nor is it 30. So there's a lot of math going on here, and a little bit has to do with this. There's a period of time before any holiday when you start learning about the holiday, which is 30 days. So 30 days before a holiday is like the period where you start preparing for it. Half of that is 15. So 49 minus 15 gets you to, does that get you to 33? Something like that. But whatever they do this complicated math thing that's very problematic. However, once they work out the math, he figures that half before from Pesach until half of Atzeret, they figure that gets you to 33. Again, You might say, shouldn't that just be half of 50, half of the Omer? But no, it has to do with taking 30 and 15 and 49. Gets really complicated. The math kind of works out, but not really. Regardless, that's what they figure out, that pros atzeret, half atzeret means 15 days before Shavuot, which is Lag BaOmer. And so that's one thing. It falls on Lag BaOmer. And what's the other thing is that is that you get married on that day. Now the question is why? Because that's when they stop dying. That's not what our Talmud says. Our Talmud says they died during that entire period. Could be a variant manuscript, but there's also one problem here is we're also assuming that pros means half. So we're going to come back to that in a moment. And Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Before we go on to kind of unpack this, we're actually going to jump ahead in time to 16th century, the Shulchan Aruch, and this is what the practice is today. This is what the custom, and the point is that Sefer HaManhig, what it established, Lag BaOmer, that you stop the morning practices, at least for that day, became the law. So go ahead, Gloria, this is source number 3.
1, it is customary not to get married between Pesach and Shavuot until Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day, because during that time, the students of Rabbi Akiva died. However, to do Erusin and Kiddushin, engagement and betrothal is okay. And even for Nisuin, marriage, if someone did so, we do not punish him. Rema, however, from Lag BaOmer onwards, all this is permitted. That's Abu Draham, Beit Yosef, and Minhagim. 2, it is customary not to cut one's hair until Lag BaOmer, since it is said that is when they stopped dying.
Excellent. So one thing that gets more complicated that's not our focus tonight is there's a question about, is Lag BaOmer a standalone day, get married on that day, and then the morning customs come back? The Ashkenazi custom, Ramah, is that after the 33rd day, everything's good. Why? Because the 33rd day is when that plague or that rebellion, whatever it was, ended. Any of Rabbi Akiva's students, they only died from Pesach until the 33rd of the Omer. Where does he get that from? From the source we saw, the Sefer HaManhig, from several centuries earlier. And again, that's generally accepted Ashkenazi custom. But we already, as I pointed out, there's already a little bit of debate in here about the significance of the 33rd day. So the question is the 33rd day special because that's when the students stop dying? Or is it special for some other reason altogether? But regardless, at this point, Lag BaOmer clearly has some significance, that all the morning customs disappear for at least that day. And Ashkenazim, we say that even though our original Talmud, the authoritative Talmud, said they died until Shavuot, that's not what it is. And we rely on that text from the 13th/12th century, that the deaths only happened until Lag BaOmer because of that word pros. Fine. But that assumes we're getting everything correct. So the question is, what does pros actually mean? So apparently in Hebrew, pros can mean broken or half. But in Greek, and I don't read Greek, but if you look at the letters, you can recognize that the first one from left to right is pi. So I'm assuming that the symbol pi is a P, and then I assume the rest of them are PR, equivalent of O and S. But that word means before. And then what's really cool, the word pros in Greek meaning before is our source of the prefix pre, which is just a really cool fact that I discovered. But there are many Greek words that are included in Talmudic and other texts. And it makes way more sense that our version of the Talmud, which says that they died from Pesach until Shavuot, would, if they had that word pros, meaning before Shavuot, it would line up, meaning they died from Pesach until just before Shavuot, and both sources work together instead of this weird 49 minus 15 instead of 25. So it makes a lot more sense that it was up until Shavuot. So the question is, how did this 12th century source and this 13th century source figure out Lag BaOmer, and why did they interpret it so wrong? And we don't know, but there is a very interesting hypothesis from this writer, Mitchell First. He writes a great article, and I will take this one. And he says, the prohibition of marriage for the full 49 days, which may have been the original practice, must have been very difficult to not get married for 49 days for the entire period from Pesach to Shavuot. Perhaps, and again, there's not real hard evidence for this, but it's a hypothesis, it's a suggestion. Perhaps the following leniency developed in some parts of France or Provence. Once a majority of the 49 days was observed, 33 days, that would suffice. They wouldn't mourn for the entire period, they would just mourn for most of it. After the 8 days of Passover, if a community would not conduct marriages from the 23rd of Nisan through the 17th of Iyar, the community would have refrained from conducting marriages for 25 days. This would reflect observance of the majority of the original 49-day prohibition, assuming credit is given for the refraining from conducting marriages on Shabbat. In other words, the rabbis are like, we need to be lenient. How can we be lenient but still, make it look good? Perhaps this was the original leniency that was later given new meaning with the erroneous connection to the students of Rabbi Akiva. Meaning, they had this thing for Rabbi Akiva to not get married. And then they were like, look, we have to start getting married. We can't go that long. And then what are we going to do? So we'll have this leniency and we'll stop on the 33rd day. And then they were like, well, why are we stopping on the 33rd day? Oh, Rabbi Akiva students must have stopped dying then. But there's zero evidence for that, and all of the text seems to imply otherwise. So in the most explicit early source, Sefer HaManhig, the prohibition on marriages ceased on the 33rd day and was not just temporarily suspended for a day. This supports the idea that the solution is not tied to a particular historical event that occurred around the 33rd day. Also, the name of the holiday is not tied to a particular historical event. This also supports the idea that what we are looking for is some type of mathematical, calendrical basic for a leniency and not a historical event. In other words, again, it has nothing to do with Rabbi Akiva and a miraculous day or anything like that. It's just trying to find a day that makes sense to get the majority. And they worked out the math and everything like that. Now, this is not 100% satisfying. Oh, well, that's perfectly makes sense. And the reason is because we don't really know why Lag BaOmer became a break in the holiday. So this hypothesis says that they just decided to be lenient for a day to give people an opportunity to get married because it was too long, and then they had to go back and rationalize it later. Now that kind of thinking, it's possible, but there's no way to prove it. So I said short answer is we don't know. And that's kind of my answer to you. We don't know why we stopped mourning on Lag BaOmer. There's basically no evidence for it, and the few texts we have don't really work for it. However, as I pointed out, by the 16th century, that was the custom, to the point where Rabbi Moshe Isserles, a brilliant rabbi, who's the basis for or codifying Ashkenazi law, says that's the day that Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying. How do you know that? Because he got it from a tradition, who got it from a tradition going back, again, and if you go back far enough, everything falls apart. So that's the first thing about why we stop mourning for Lag BaOmer. And again, if you assume that's when the plague stopped, then it makes sense to stop all the mourning. But if you're just looking for a break in the day, you're just saying we need one day where we can do marriages, and we'll just agree that it's this day because we're most of the way through, then it doesn't make sense to stop all the mourning. It makes sense to get married on the 33rd and go back to it, which many Jews do today. So any questions before we go on to the second big part of Lag BaOmer, the party aspect? Excellent. So this next source here, let's see if I can zoom in and make it a little better. And Leonard, is this good? Is this big?
Yes, it's okay.
Excellent. So the background of this is, I'm going to actually jump forward a little bit and kind of give you the abstract. There's a number of other, basically the other aspect of Yom Kippur, of Lag BaOmer, and why it's a huge day of celebration is because it's honoring the memory, the Yaret site of this man, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rashbi, who was mentioned in that source of the Talmud, is after all of Rabbi Akiva's students died, he found 5 new disciples. One of them was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is famous not only as a rabbi of the Talmud, but he's purported to be the author of the Zohar. Not the only, but one of the main Kabbalistic texts. Now, there's 2 hypotheses for when this book was written. One is that it was written in the times of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, so that would be, in the times of the Romans. The other one that it was written in the, I want to say 13th century by a man named Moshe de Leon. One compromise view is that the 13th century version, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that century wrong, but I think that's what it was, but that version was based on earlier texts that perhaps were based on traditions passed down orally, going all the way back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That's a possibility. And another one is to say that in the Kabbalistic mystical realm, they believed in getting prophecies, that you could have a dream and actually hear words, real Torah from ghosts, from people who passed away. And whether or not you believe it, that is a part of our tradition. So Moshe de Leon may have one hypothesis, is he wrote this book literally being inspired by the soul of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So regardless of who actually authored it, it talks a lot about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it's a fairly authoritative text that influences a lot of Jewish law, but it also talks about the life of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whether or not it's historical, prophetic, or just a midrash. It's mostly midrash. This is the context of this book, and here's the story that talks about the end of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's life, who, by the way, not only was disciple of Rabbi Akiva, but when the Romans famously were going to burn down the city, he was smuggled out in a coffin. And then he went to I'm blanking on the name of the Roman Empire, emperor there, not the empire, I think Vespasian. And he said, you're going to be the next emperor you're going to be the next Caesar. And if that comes true, promise you'll do something for me. What do you want from me, little Jew? Let me build a new academy, somewhere away from Israel, or somewhere, that will be safe. And Vespasian said, go for it, little Jew. And he did. And that became, whether or not it happened exactly that way, Torah grew and continued because of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That's not a Zohar source. That's in the Talmud. That's a fundamental story. So this rabbi is a big deal. Again, how much myth is around it doesn't matter. He clearly is such a key and important part to making sure our tradition continues. And here are the moments purportedly at the end of his life. Go ahead, please, Leonard.
On the day that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was to leave the world, he organized his teachings. His friends came to his room and he said to them, quote, now is a time of favor. I can now reveal to you holy things that have not been revealed until now, unquote. All that day, the fire never left his room, and there was no one who was able to approach him. As the light and the fire were surrounding him after he passed away, and they came to bury him, the fire flew into the air and danced before him. A voice was heard from the heavens saying, come and gather every year for the
Hilula
anniversary of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai.
Excellent, thank you. Now, this story, it's a beautiful moment, and the idea of fire in mysticism, there being words like energy of fire coming out of the Torah, the fire of God inspiring us, it's a very common image of fire of Torah. And he, who had shared all these mystical secrets, that at the end of his life would be, imbuing that fire into his students. So again, forget about the mythology around it, the accuracy of it. It's just a beautiful image. And there's two other beautiful aspects of it, is that it's not called a day of sadness, it's called a Yom Hilula, which can be translated here as anniversary. I've seen it translated as a wedding day, but it's clearly a time of great joy. It is a day of great joy to remember Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai when he passed away. Now, typically on a remembrance of when someone passed away, a yard site, it's not always a day of great sadness, but often it is. To remember those we've lost brings this sadness because we miss them. And he says, no, remember all the good I did. Remember the teachings I passed on. It should be a great day of joy for you. So whenever his yard site should be a day of celebration. And it sounds like we're getting closer to where we want to end up, except what is not mentioned here at all is Lag BaOmer. It doesn't mention it all. It doesn't imply it. It's not implicit. There's no hints towards it whatsoever. It doesn't mention Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, nor does it mention the 18th of Iyar at all. So again, now you have to kind of jump forward in history. And at what point did his yahrzeit, which was a real historical moment, I mean, he passed away at some moment, when did it become associated with Lag BaOmer? And again, you have one of those texts where if you start to look more carefully at it, things start to fall apart. So let's see, Jane, I'm going to go back to you. And this is a work called Pri Etz Chaim, and it is from a Rabbi Chaim Vital. Rabbi Chaim Vital was a student of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, Isaac Luria, who was known as Arizal, the lion. And the Arizal took much of mystical Kabbalistic writings and thought, and he kind of made it more accessible to people. He added his own traditions, etc. And now he was living in Tzfat. He was living after the time, he probably coincided with Rav Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. So this is after, this is written, sorry, Arizal would have been like kind of contemporary with that, but this was written after the Shulchan Aruch was closed, but they're all living in kind of that same part of the world in Israel, where mysticism is just having an explosion. So the Rabbi Chaim Vital is now trying to compile teachings or traditions that he got from his teacher, whether he saw them written or he heard them verbally. And this one is a letter that he saw from his teacher. And this is what he said about a particular custom, and I'll unpack this after you read it, Jane. Go ahead.
It appears from all of this, the custom to visit Mount Meron on Lag BaOmer. The reason is that Rashbi died on Lag BaOmer because he was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva mentioned earlier that died during the counting of the Omer.
Excellent, thank you. So we get a lot of information in here. One of them is that there's this custom to visit Mount Meron, which is still a custom today, and specifically on Lag BaOmer. But one of the issues is there's an earlier text, I don't recall if I brought it, I might have brought it later, but there's a text that does mention Lag BaOmer and going to Mount Meron, but it doesn't say it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. In fact, from the context of it, an earlier tradition, it almost certainly is referring to Hillel and Shammai from the Talmud. So now we're starting to get some pieces going together about Lag BaOmer having some significance. Again, our first significance, it was the yard site of Yehoshua. Then later, it became the yard site of these other figures. So it's been a yard site for a lot of different figures, and it kind of continues to be a yard site. But the real big thing that happened here is this. This version of the text, I'm going to scroll over to the right, is I bolded it. And the reason for this custom of Lag BaOmer is because that's when Shemet Rashbi Bayom Lag BaOmer. Except every other version of it doesn't say Shemet would mean that he died, that Rashbi died. But that's not what it says. Every single one of them says Sameach Rashbi, the joy of Rashbi, which goes back to that source in the Zohar. Yom Hilul, of this day of joy of Rashbi. So it never says that he died on Lag BaOmer. Rather, it was a day of joy for him. Why was it a day of joy for him? Because on Lag BaOmer, according to these traditions, it's when he received the Torah from Rabbi Akiva. So Lag BaOmer is not a yard site, this tradition. It becomes a day when the Torah gets passed on. But another thing to point out here is it says that Rashbi was of the students who died of Rabbi Akiva. Except if he died during this period, what's the problem with everything else we've seen so far? If he's one of the 5 disciples that was supposed to pass on Torah, but he died, then there's no way that he was able to pass on the Torah. So there's countless mistakes in this. So again, what you have is there was some cut, and this is one of the things about customs. A lot of them will eventually clash and smash into each other until something new comes out. So at some point, and the reason I'm saying at some point is we don't know. At some point, they developed a custom to visit Mount Meron, which was associated with, on Lag BaOmer, which was associated with the yard site of certain figures, not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But because of this mistaken typo in a letter, it was associated with the death of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai on Lag BaOmer, but that's impossible. He couldn't have died on Lag BaOmer because we wouldn't have the Torah today. We wouldn't have rabbinic Judaism. So it absolutely couldn't have been. And if it was his yard site, then it shouldn't be a day of joy. It should be a day of sadness. But that's an interesting rabbinic discussion because the Zohar implies that he said he wanted his day of death to be a day of joy. So that kind of fixes that problem. But again, he didn't die on that day. So how did Lag BaOmer become a day of great celebration? So we jump forward much more recent, 19th century, where regardless of all of those issues, you get to this Tzvi Elimelech Tzpir of Dinov. It is Bnei Yisachar and Lynn. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And you see that at this point, it doesn't matter all the things I pointed out, which again, have been pointed out by great, there is not ultra-Orthodox, but great traditionally respected rabbis. None of that matters anymore. We take it all for granted, and we get to this, please.
Rabbi
Leah.
Shimon Bar Yochai was called the Holy Lamp because through him were revealed the secrets of the Torah. That is, the secret of the light that was good, which is hidden in the Torah. Therefore, his holy book is called the Zohar, literally brilliance, meaning a light which shines from one end of the world to the other, the good light which is hidden away in the Torah. That is why this day is the best of days for giving the Torah. This is when the good light in the Torah began to shine to, I think that might mean shine forth, as we've learned. And this day is the 33rd day of the Omer, Lag BaOmer. This is the day of the Hilulah, literally rejoicing, of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the very day on which he ascended to the highest heavens. It also makes sense to assume that he was born on this day as well, because the Holy One sits and completes the year of the righteous from day to day.
Excellent. Now, what you've seen is now he's taken for granted the idea that he died, that the Zohar talks about his death, but it mentions nothing of the date whatsoever. There's no sources for that. But then you have this Lamed Gimel BaOmer that takes on the significance, and it's a yard site of somebody. And then at some point it becomes associated with him. And by this point, by the 19th century, it's taken for granted that the 33rd day of the Omer is the one the Zohar was talking about. But another thing to point out here, he also says, oh, and because of this other tradition, he must also have been born on that day, because I think it's like Mark Twain, like went in and out with Halley's Comet. Although that there may be some truth to that, but here he's saying, oh, there's a tradition, so he must have been born on the day. But the problem is, someone reads this, then they write in English a book about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a real man and a great man, and it says he was born on the 33rd day of the Omer, and it doesn't mention any of these assumptions or traditions or any proof for it. It's just, oh, I read a source that said it, and that's the problem. I read it in an old source, and because it's old, it's authoritative, and therefore I'll stay it. And someone reads what I read and they don't see any of the buildup or the background, so they can't challenge it, they can't question it, they can't unpack it, and then you just start taking things for granted. So if you Google, why do we party on the 33rd day of Omer? They'll say it's the yard site of Rashbi, and because the Zohar calls his yard site a Yom Hilula, a day of celebrating, instead of being sad and fasting on that day, which is the common custom, we party. That's fine. Because if it's true that he died on the 33rd day, and the point of the Zohar is he wanted his day of death to be a day of joy because of the Torah he passed on, that's fine. But again, 33rd day of the Omer keeps being sort of shunted off, pushed off, like no one actually explains. Yeah, Tamar, go ahead, please.
No.
Oh, you're just stretching out your arm. The 33rd day of the Omer, there's not been a single established good source for its significance. But again, once people kind of play with it, and they eventually at some point they forget that it doesn't have a strong basis. And again, you get to these Google searches where it's established with perfect confidence of what the day is. And one of the other interesting things here is going back to the idea of, this is actually the source I mentioned, another one that talking about the 23rd of the Omer, or sorry, not the 23rd, the 33rd of the Omer, it was established as a Yaret site, is one of the earliest sources for that was the 15th century. Rabbi Ovadia Bartnur, who wrote probably one of the best commentaries on the Mishnah, and this was in a letter he wrote to his brother. And this is brought in a fairly contemporary work, which you can get in English, and it's an excellent work that just kind of walks you through the whole calendar of the year, called Sefer HaToda'ah by Rabbi Eliyahu Kitov, and he mentions this. So I'll just take this one. So Rabbi Ovadia Bartnura in the 15th century, and again, this would be early enough that it could be taken for granted by these later sources in the 16th century, where it said that he died on Lag BaOmer. So I almost should have brought this earlier. But in this letter, he talks about the 18th of Iyar, Yud Chet Ba'Iyar, which is always Lag BaOmer, is the day of his death. Now, in this text, Sefer HaToda'ah includes Rashbi. The letter didn't. All the letter said is, it's the yard site of his death. And people come from all around to Mount Meron and they light large fires. So that's an early source for the idea of lighting these bonfires. And they light them as a kind of yard site candle. So as a side point, why are we lighting bonfires? Because this is one of our earlier sources for it. Because on what day do we light fires? On a yard site, we light candles. Now, he actually says here these large fires are actually separate from the yard site candles. But again, the thing is, he says there's a yahrzeit for someone who died on the 18th of Iyar, Lag BaOmer. But he never says it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And this is what I mentioned earlier. There are other sources, and again, I didn't want this to be 30 pages long. There are other sources that mention this, and they explicitly mention Hillel and Shammai from the Torah. Now, again, if you go back historically, is there any evidence of the exact say they died? Not necessarily, but there's certainly more tradition for that than Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So again, there's little and big gaps. How do we get from the yahrzeit of some other guys to this day becoming a yahrzeit in general and shifting it onto Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? We don't really 100% know, except Lag BaOmer is during the period of the Omer in which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a significant figure. But again, as I pointed out, it can't be his yahrzeit. He couldn't have died then because nothing would make sense within Judaism. So it's really a wild jump there. But again, this work, Sefer Toda'ah and others, have mistakenly interpreted this letter and inserted Rashbi when that's never what was written. So now, as the last source there. So what we're left with now is, again, mysteries inside of mysteries, and there's not a good answer. And not only is there not a good answer, but some of the things that we assume, it's a great day of celebration to honor the great Torah of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It can't be Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If he died on that day, we wouldn't have Torah to be able to celebrate. So this just shows that the way traditions develop is at some point, they just start taking things for granted. And again, if you start going back and back and back, you're going to start finding some problems. But that is not the way that traditions eventually are presented. They're presented as this has always been the truth from time immemorial. Now, taking a step back though, Lag BaOmer, we've accepted it as a tradition that that's a day where we stop mourning. It's a day of joy. That's a fact. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a great man who is deserving of celebration. So the fact is, this is all minhag. This is all custom. This is not about understanding a mitzvah commandment from the Torah. It's not even about law per se, halacha. It's minhag. So there is a lot of room for changing. But again, if you really want to dig deep and you want to make certain historical claims, be sure that your claims make sense and they're built on something. Because if you're going to base your claims off of a typo, then people are going to push back. And again, this is not just a modern academic, scholarly, liberal thing. Plenty of traditional rabbis have pushed back. So on this Lag BaOmer, the accepted custom is I will trim my beard without question. I'm not going to Mount Meron to light bonfires for a lot of reasons. But if someone says, oh, this is the yahrzeit of Rashbi, you can say to them, oh, how do we know that? And if they point out this source, you could say, where did they get it from? And eventually they're going to get to the point where they're going to say, I don't know, it's just the tradition. And that's actually one of the most beautiful and mind-numbing things about our religion is so many things are just tradition, and that's not bad. It gives us a strong foundation to build on. It ties us together, but sometimes traditions don't always make sense. So it's the beauty and the weakness of it. So this Lag BaOmer, whatever you do, and if you have a beard, you can definitely trim it. Remember that traditions change, they build on each other, but more importantly, we wouldn't even get to have this rich, beautiful tradition of Judaism without men like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So whether or not it was his yahrzeit or not, any day is a good day to celebrate this great man and his four other, and their wives and their children who helped pass on Torah to this day.